Good morrow, one and all. I'm Mr. King, and welcome to this analysis video of Thomas Hardy's poem, The Man He Killed. Let's dive straight into it today and think about what on earth this poem is about and what is going on. So, this poem was written by Thomas Hardy in 1902, and it was written in response to the Second Boer War, which was between Britain and the South African Republic and the Orange Free State in the region of where modern South Africa is today. Now, this poem explores three different types of conflict. As the name of the poem suggests, it's going to be about a physical conflict, the conflict of one soldier killing another soldier. But more importantly, it's about the internal conflict that the narrator goes through, his guilt and his feelings of anxiety after he kills a soldier. And there are also going to be some references to a wider class conflict, and I wonder if you'll pick up on those as we read through the poem together. So the plan, as always, we'll read through the poem, we will check we understand all of the key vocabulary. If you think you don't need that, then please feel free to skip ahead to the next section, which is the analysis, where I will talk through the poem stanza by stanza and pick out some language and structural features for you. So, on to the poem itself. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, we should have sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin. But ranged as infantry, and staring face to face, I shot at him as he at me, and killed him in his place. I shot him dead because he was my foe. Just so, my foe, of course he was, that's clear enough. Although he thought he'd list perhaps, off-hand like just as I was out of work, had sold his traps. No other reason why. Yes, quaint and curious war is. You shoot a fellow down, you'd treat if met where any bar is, or help to half a crown. So, what is this poem about? This poem is about one person, the narrator of this poem, killing another person. And the narrator of this poem feels a lot of guilt about killing this person. And in this poem, the narrator thinks about why he killed the other poem. And we see the poem wrestle with his feelings of guilt and anxiety as he struggles to justify why he killed this person. The poem begins with the narrator thinking, do you know what? If I'd met this other soldier in a pub somewhere, we might have had a really good time together. We'd have probably sat down, had a few drinks together. Unfortunately, they didn't meet at an inn, they didn't meet at a pub, they met on the battlefield where they were forced to shoot at one another. And the narrator of this poem was the victor, he killed the other person dead, and now he's left with all of these feelings of guilt and anxiety. So as I said, in the first stanza, we begin with our narrator thinking that if he'd met the other soldier at a pub somewhere, or to use Hardy's words, if he'd met at an old ancient inn, which is a pub, they'd have had a really good time, they'd have had a few drinks together. The phrase, sat us down to wet right many a nipperkin, just means we'd have sat down together and had a lot of drinks. A nipperkin is a word used in Dorset and other places in the UK, which just refers to a third of a pint. So they'd have sat down and had lots of pints together, lots of thirds of pints. Unfortunately, they didn't meet in a pub somewhere. They met as infantry, line 5, arranged as infantry. They were staring face to face on other sides of the battlefield, and they were forced to shoot at each other. I shot at him as he at me, but the narrator was the one who killed him in his place. So the narrator won, the other soldier lost and was killed. And then in the third stanza, we see our narrator try to justify why exactly he killed the other person. I shot him dead because he was my foe. It's almost like he's struggling to find a reason. He ends up saying that the other soldier was his foe, was his enemy. But foe is a very unusual word to use. Foe is a very formal word, and our narrator doesn't seem like a very formal type of person. So perhaps our narrator is using this word that he heard other officers use. Perhaps he's just using other words that he heard his superiors use in an attempt to justify what he did. He's heard his officers say, "You've got to go and kill the foe, go and kill the enemy." And so the narrator is falling back on these words, but they just seem insufficient. And then he thinks more about the person he killed. He thought he'd list, which means enlist or sign up. He thought he'd enlist, he'd join the army casually, in an offhand way, in a spur of the moment sort of thing. Yeah, I'll sign up to the army. He thought he'd enlist offhand like. Maybe the dead soldier was out of work, had sold his traps, had sold his hunting gear, maybe he was a gamekeeper, and he needed the job. So he signed up to the army to get a job. He was just a person looking for a job. Does he deserve to be killed for that? The implication of his poem is no, he doesn't. And Hardy ends his poem by saying that war is quaint and curious, which means war is unusual and old-fashioned. War does not make sense. Here Hardy concludes his poem by condemning war. War is quaint, it is curious, because you're forced to shoot people who, if you met in any other circumstance, you'd probably get on really well with. You shoot a fellow down that you would treat, you'd buy drinks for if you met in a bar, or maybe you'd even lend money to that person, you'd help them to half a crown. War does not make sense because two people who would normally get on are forced to kill each other. And in essence, that's really the heart of this poem. War does not make sense. So, having looked at what this poem is about, let's move on to some analysis of language and structural features, and we'll go through stanza by stanza. So, as I said earlier, this poem is about the narrator of this poem killing another person, and throughout this poem, the narrator really struggles to justify exactly why he killed the enemy soldier. He begins in stanza 1 by saying that if they'd met in a pub, if they'd met in an old ancient inn, they'd have sat down together and had a few drinks. It's quite cheerful, it's quite positive. A world without war is a cheerful and positive place, and that's my first point. We can see that a world without war is a cheerful and positive place because of the informal tone used in the poem. We have Hardy's Dorset dialect come through in phrases like "sat us down to wet" and "many a nipperkin." This implies that the two people would have been casually happy together, informal and cheerful in a world without war. Furthermore, the cheerful tone is reinforced by the metre of the poem. As I read through the poem, perhaps you could hear the beat to the poem. Had he and I but met by some old ancient inn, but ranged as infantry, and staring face to face. That rhythm, dee-dum, 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 it's called iambic trimeter. Tri means three, so 3 lots of something. And here we have 3 lots of iambs. So you might know iambic pentameter from Shakespeare. That's 5 lots of iambs. Here we've got iambic trimeter, 3 lots of iambs, 3 lots of dee-dum, dee-dum, dee-dum. So in the first, second and fourth lines we have this iambic trimeter, and that creates a cheerful tone. This implies that a world without war is a cheerful place, as we see in the first stanza. Furthermore, we have a lovely rhyme scheme that goes throughout this poem. The first line of the poem ends with the word met. That rhymes with the word wet in the third line. We have the word in, which rhymes with nipperkin. So we've got this A-B rhyme scheme. And once again, this creates a very cheerful, a very pleasant tone, which implies in stanza 1 that a world without war is a cheerful and pleasant place. Unfortunately, that does not continue, because in the second stanza, we see that the soldiers do not meet together in a pub. They meet at opposite sides of a battlefield. They're ranged as infantry, and they are forced to shoot at each other. And there's a very sharp contrast between the cheerful tone of the first stanza and the much more ominous tone of the second stanza. We've got violent verbs like shot and killed, words like staring and infantry, these quite ominous words which show that the tone has changed, war is awful, and the contrast between the cheerful tone of the first stanza and the more ominous tone of the second stanza shows that war has made the world a much darker place. Now you might have noticed that the iambic trimeter and the ABAB rhyme scheme continues throughout all of the stanzas. So you might be wondering, why has this meter been used in the whole poem? It doesn't make sense. The meter creates a really cheerful tone, and I thought this was an anti-war poem. Furthermore, you might be wondering, why is the rhyme scheme being used? I said earlier that the rhyme scheme creates a really cheerful tone. Why has a cheerful rhyme scheme been used in an anti-war poem? Well, I would suggest that it is ironic that the poem talks about such a dreadful situation with such a cheerful tone and meter and rhyme scheme. If we want a cheerful and pleasant world, like the one described in stanza 1, then war does not belong. This suggests that we should get rid of war altogether. It doesn't make sense. So Hardy's use of the trimeter and the rhyme scheme in the rest of the poem is ironic. It doesn't make sense to talk about war like this in this cheerful way. The solution, therefore, is we should get rid of war altogether, and the world will be a much more cheerful and pleasant place. As well as the really ominous tone in the second stanza, you could also argue there's a very matter-of-fact tone. Raines's infantry, staring face to face, I shot at him, as he at me, and killed him in his place. There's no emotive language, no hyperbole, no dramatic adjectives. He simply states, this is what you have to do in war. This makes war seem inevitable, and I would suggest that's quite depressing. It's quite depressing that the narrator can talk about war in such a matter-of-fact way. This is a subtle hint that war does not make sense. It doesn't make sense that war exists in such a way that soldiers are able to talk about death in such a matter-of-fact way. That's just not right. And then we end the second stanza with a full stop. I killed him in his place. Full stop. That's called end stopping, when there's a full stop at the end of a line. And it just reinforces, this soldier is dead. It's over with now. It's done. It's very matter of fact. I don't know about you, but to me that comes across as a little bit callous. I would expect the death of a soldier to be described in an emotional way. And this reinforces the fact that war has made the narrator of this poem quite emotionless. It's kind of taken away some of his humanity, the fact that he's able to do such violent things in such a matter-of-fact way. We see that war dehumanizes the narrator here to some extent. Some emotion does begin to creep into the poem in the third stanza, and the emotion that appears most prominently is the emotion of guilt. The narrator feels guilt for killing the other soldier. Now, how do we know that? It doesn't say the narrator feels guilty, so how can we work out that the narrator feels guilty? Well, the main thing to say is that the narrator really struggles to justify why he killed the other soldier. We can see this because of the fact he repeats himself. I shot him dead because he was my foe. The repetition of the word because here suggests that the narrator is really struggling to think of any good reason why he killed the other soldier. And when he does think of a reason, he says, because he was my foe. Those words don't really sound like his own. They sound like a phrase that he heard his officers use, because he was your foe. It's almost like he's repeating something he heard someone else say, but he doesn't really believe it. Furthermore, we've got more repetition. We've got the repetition of the word foe also. And the fact that the narrator repeats himself so often shows that he's struggling to think of a reason to justify why he killed the other soldier. This suggests that there is no justification. There is no good justification for killing another soldier. And that reinforces Hardy's message that war is cruel, unnecessary, and unjustifiable. We can see that the narrator feels guilt and uncertainty through the caesuras in this poem, in this stanza also. In stanza 3, there are lots of pauses, there's lots of stopping and starting, and the pauses are created by the punctuation. I shot him dead because, because he was my foe, just so, : all of these punctuation points, they make us pause as we read the poem. This suggests that the narrator is stopping and starting. His thought process is stopping and starting. The narrator clearly here has a stopping, starting frame of mind. He's a really fragmented state of mind, and this fragmented state of mind reflects his guilt and uncertainty. And even though he does his best to justify why he killed the other soldier, even though he comes up with some kind of answer in stanza 3, he almost contradicts himself and undermines himself with the last word of his stanza, although. Even though he's thought of this reason, he says although, however, he almost doubts the reason he gave. And the enjambment here really draws our attention to the word although. Although really stands out. This suggests Hardy wants us to know that the narrator doesn't really believe the reason he just gave, and this implies that war really is unjustifiable. In stanza 4, the narrator's internal conflict continues as he reflects on the fact that he had so much in common with the man he killed. Perhaps, just like the narrator, the man he killed joined the army because he was out of work and needed the job. Perhaps the man he'd killed had already sold everything he'd owned, had sold his traps, and there was no other reason why he joined the army other than to earn a bit of money. And here, this is where the theme of class conflict begins to be introduced into the poem. Perhaps both the narrator and the man he killed only signed up to go to war because they were poor. And here, Hardy is suggesting that perhaps governments are taking advantage of people's lack of money. Perhaps governments are exploiting people's poverty by paying them to go to war and to commit these acts of violence. So here we have a very subtle hint that Hardy is criticising governments for taking advantage of people's poverty by paying them to go to war. And this is why, in the 5th stanza, Hardy concludes very firmly, yes, quaint and curious war is. Quaint and curious war is a very matter-of-fact, declarative sentence, which just means a strong statement of fact, in which Hardy criticises war. He calls war quaint, which means it's old-fashioned. It has no place in civilised society. We should not allow war to exist in this civilized day and age. After all, people on both sides of the battlefield are fundamentally all human beings. They're all similar people. Why should they be made to shoot at each other? And we see in this final stanza two visions of two very different worlds. On the one hand, you have a world where people are forced to shoot at each other. Or, on the other hand, you have a world where fellows can sit together and treat each other to drinks and, help each other out by lending them money when they're struggling. And the question to us as readers is, which vision do we prefer? Do we prefer the vision of the world where people are forced to shoot at each other, where war exists? Or do we prefer a world where people are kind to each other, where they help at each other? And I think most of us would state quite clearly we'd prefer a world where there isn't a war, where people don't have to shoot at each other. And this is why war is awful. This is why Hardy criticises war, because war gets in the way of this vision of a civilised and peaceful world. Now you might have noticed that we have begun and ended this poem in the same place. We began this poem with two people in a bar, in an old ancient inn, buying drinks for each other, and we end the poem in a similar place, with people in a bar paying for drinks for each other. Why do we begin and end this poem in the same place, or why is there a circular structure, which is just another way of saying that the poem begins and ends in the same place? Well, if the poem begins and ends in the same place, it's going round in a circle, and circles can't be broken. A circle will go round forever, again and again and again. Perhaps this circular structure of this poem suggests that war is going to go on again and again and again. War is inevitable. It will go on again and again. And something drastic needs to happen to break this cycle so that we can stop war continuing, so we can stop a world where death and destruction is allowed to take place. So perhaps the circular structure of this poem is a reflection of the way that war is, but not the way that Hardy would like war to be. He would prefer war to end and to stop altogether. So I hope you found this video helpful. I'm going to put on the screen 5 quotes I would memorize for this poem, although truth be told, I think this poem is so short and so useful that I would encourage you to spend a bit of time trying to memorize as much of it as you can, if not the entire poem. I do think it is achievable for students to memorize certainly 3 or 4 poems in full going into the exam, which would give you a really strong starting point. That's not to say you should only revise 3 or 4 poems, but realistically there are going to be some poems you will know in better detail than others, and so while it's important that you have a good working knowledge of all of the poems, it is understandable that you might spend a bit more time on 3 or 4 poems, which might be your preferred poems to go to if the question permits it in the exam. I would remember my comment about the circular structure as well as the quotes on the screen. So this has been my analysis of the poem The Man He Killed. I hope you found it useful. If you have, please hit those like and subscribe buttons, and there's something about a bell now, so press that, click that. I can't truthfully claim to understand how all that works, but do click that button, and if you would like more videos, do let me know in the comments below. If you have exams coming up, best of luck to you, and until next time, cheerio.